Book the Second, Chapter 4 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Second, Chapter 4. The March of Events. Midwinter's face darkened when the last trace of the carriage had disappeared from view. "I have done my best," he said, as he turned back gloomily into the house. "If Mr. Brock himself were here, Mr. Brock could do no more." He looked at the bunch of keys which Allan had thrust into his hand, and a sudden longing to put himself to the test over the steward's book took possession of his sensitive, self-tormenting nature. Inquiring his way to the room in which the various movables of the steward's office had been provisionally placed after the letting of the cottage, he sat down at the desk and tried how his own unaided capacity would guide him through the business records of the Thorpe Ambrose estate. The result exposed his own ignorance unanswerably before his own eyes. The ledgers bewildered him, the leases, the plans, and even the correspondence itself might have been written, for all he could understand of them, in an unknown tongue. His memory reverted bitterly as he left the room again to his 2 years' solitary self-instruction in the Shrewsbury bookseller's shop. "If I could only have worked at a business," he thought, "if I could only have known that the company of poets and philosophers was company too high for a vagabond like me!" He sat down alone in the great hall. The silence of it fell heavier and heavier on his sinking spirits. The beauty of it exasperated him, like an insult from a purse-proud man. "Curse the place," he said, snatching up his hat and stick. "I like the bleakest hillside I ever slept on better than I like this house." He impatiently descended the doorsteps, and stopped on the drive, considering by which direction he should leave the park for the country beyond. If he followed the road taken by the carriage, he might risk unsettling Allan by accidentally meeting him in the town. If he went out by the back gate, he knew his own nature well enough to doubt his ability to pass the room of the dream without entering it again. But one another way remained, the way which he had taken and then abandoned again in the morning. There was no fear of disturbing Allan and the major's daughter now. Without further hesitation, Midwinter set forth through the gardens to explore the open country on that side of the estate. Thrown off its balance by the events of the day, his mind was full of that sorely savage resistance to the inevitable self-assertion of wealth, so amiably deplored by the prosperous and the rich, so bitterly familiar to the unfortunate and the poor. "The Heatherwell costs nothing," he thought, looking contemptuously at the masses of rare and beautiful flowers that surrounded him, "and the buttercups and daisies are as bright as the best of you." He followed the artfully contrived ovals and squares of the Italian garden with a vagabond indifference to the symmetry of their construction and the ingenuity of their design. "How many pounds a foot did you cost?" he said, looking back with scornful eyes at the last path as he left it. wind away over high and low, like the sheep walk on the mountainside, if you can. He entered the shrubbery which Allan had entered before him, crossed the paddock and the rustic bridge beyond, and reached the major's cottage. His ready mind seized the right conclusion at the first sight of it, and he stopped before the garden gate to look at the trim little residence which would never have been empty, and would never have been let, but for Allan's ill advised resolution to force the steward's situation on his friend. The summer afternoon was warm. The summer air was faint and still. On the upper and the lower floor of the cottage the windows were all open. From one of them, on the upper story, the sound of voices was startlingly audible in the quiet of the park, as Midwinter paused on the outer side of the garden enclosure. The voice of a woman, harsh, high, and angrily complaining. A voice with all the freshness and the melody gone, and with nothing but the hard power of it left, was discordantly predominant sound. With it, from moment to moment, there mingled the deeper and quieter tones, soothing and compassionate, of the voice of a man. Though the distance was too great to allow Midwinter to distinguish the words that were spoken, he felt the impropriety of remaining within hearing of the voices, and at once stepped forward to continue his walk. At the same moment, the face of a young girl, easily recognizable as the face of Miss Milroy from Allan's description of her, appeared at the open window of the room. In spite of himself, Midwinter paused to look at her. The expression of the bright young face which had smiled so prettily at Allan was weary and disheartened. After looking out absently over the park, she suddenly turned her head back into the room, her attention having been apparently struck by something that had just been said in it. "Oh, mamma, mamma!" she exclaimed, indignantly, "how can you say such things?" The words were spoken close to the window. They reached Midwinter's ears, and hurried him away before he heard more. But the self disclosure of Major Milroy's domestic position had not reached its end yet. As Midwinter turned the corner of the garden fence, a tradesman's boy was handing a parcel in at the wicket gate to the woman servant. "Well," said the boy, with the irrepressible impudence of his class, "how is the missus?" The woman lifted her hand to box his ears. "How is the missus?" she repeated, with an angry toss of her head, as the boy ran off. If it would only please God to take the missus, it would be a blessing to everybody in the house. No such ill-omened shadow as this had passed over the bright domestic picture of the inhabitants of the cottage, which Allan's enthusiasm had painted for the contemplation of his friend. It was plain that the secret of the tenants had been kept from the landlord so far. 5 minutes more of walking brought Midwinter to the park gates. "Am I fated to see nothing and hear nothing today which can give me heart and hope for the future?" he thought, as he angrily swung back the lodge gate. Even the people Allan has let the cottage to are people whose lives are embittered by a household misery which it is my misfortune to have found out. He took the